Okay, guys, I think we're going to get going. And what we're going to try to do this afternoon is a couple of things. Number one, we're going to just give you the magic wand, how to craft state legislation so that you can save your PEG funding, you can grow, no, not really. But we're going to try to at least give you a little bit of a roadmap of what's happening around the country right now with regard to state legislation that might be helpful to, we don't have a loud voice, I guess. Okay, let me, okay. So what we're going to try to do is kind of give you a sense of what's happening in various states around the country with regard to attempts to change state law that might in fact positively impact community media and PEG. It's primarily a lot of it's related to funding, but there's, we have the bigger picture as well of HD and all those other pieces. We're going to kind of focus on the funding part today, but really changing the legislation is something that could address a lot of other things. But before we get going, and before I introduce my wonderful panel here, what questions do you bring to this meeting? What would you like to take away so that that'll help us focus our comments a little bit?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So, anybody? All right, you're not falling asleep after lunch. It's not permitted, okay?
I'd like to know where you're all from. Is everybody from California and Hawaii? Where else are we from?
Michigan.
Michigan, nice.
Philly?
Philly,
Yeah.
okay.
Do we have New Mexico in the room? We don't have New Mexico in the room. We have some New Mexico folks
Good.
here.
All right.
So one of the things, just to sort of remind everybody about, is that the degree, what you can do, and the degree to which you can change state law that might positively affect access has a lot to do with what your state law says right now. And we're going to dive into that piece as part of what we're going to talk about overall this afternoon. But I'm going to start and do a real quick, well, I'm going to have these folks introduce. I could introduce you guys, but why don't you each introduce yourself? Mike?
Okay, that's a nice change up. My name's Mike Bradley. I'm an attorney at Bradley Werner. Our offices are located in Minneapolis, Minnesota, Chicago, and we have an attorney in Philadelphia. We have worked over the last, 25 years really with local governments and access organizations on all of their legal issues over the years. Right now, I've made it a big focus to really help local governments and access organizations trying to figure out what we're going to do for the next 40 years. We've had a mechanism in place really with franchising, franchise fees, PEG fees to fund access organizations, and it's worked very well really for the last 40 years. But the landscape's changing. We'll talk a little bit about that, but we probably don't have to tell you that. We all know it's changing. And the next thing that we have to think about is, well, what are we going to do next to make it last for another 40 years? So anyway, thank you for inviting me to be here in California. I was thrilled to be invited to California in March because it's still not very nice in Minnesota. When I left, Mike Wassenaar will appreciate this. He's from St. Paul. And Chad Johnston will appreciate it too, since he came and left St. Paul. I had to leave to go to the airport at 4:30 in the morning. That's not a big deal. But it snowed overnight, and it snowed a foot. And thank goodness my Uber driver could make it up the road. Anyway, I was happy to land in California. So thanks for inviting me.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Good to see you. I'm Jeff Bain. I'm a partner at the law firm Spiegel and McDermott in D.C., also on the ACM board. Spiegel, we work on both energy and telecom with cities, municipal utilities, community media centers. I started on this probably about 10 years ago. Jim Horwood was my introduction into this, and worked with him, and he was I remember, in my first year, some assignment coming across my desk, and ACM, who is this? Some FCC rulemaking. Yeah, this is great. People come in, And I've been here ever since, and it's been great. I've been involved in some of the state issues that have been going on, some work representing ACM and ACD on some of these matters. And there's a lot going on at the state level, and we'll talk about this more some, but I think that's where there's a chance to actually see some progress and some action in the next several years, because anything coming out of the federal level on these issues is not going to be on the helpful side. But there is a lot of interesting work and a lot of momentum building at the state level, so I'm really excited about this topic.
Tracy?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Tracy Rosenberg. I'm the Executive Director of Media Alliance. We are an independent nonprofit, not a PEG, but we support independent and alternative community media. My organization has been around for about 40 years. It started out as kind of a journalism type association, but as journalism has collapsed all around us, as we've discussed, we have sort of morphed ourselves into kind of policy advocates around telecommunications and digital platforms, and trying to make the rules of the road that kind of govern how we talk to each other and how we exchange information work for the people instead of for the corporations. I am also a member of the ACM West Board, and I guess the newly elected member of the board's Public Policy Committee, which is planning to work on these issues actively in the states of primarily California and Hawaii, although we are open to other Western states in the region if you guys will come and tell us what we need to do. And I just wanted to invite everyone here, if they are interested in being more active in ACM's policy work or becoming active in it, that we have set up this new kind of conduit, and we would love for you to join us and help us execute our ambitious plans.
So, I'm going to throw it out again. What questions you want us to answer? What do you want to learn today? Yeah, Crab.
I'm curious if we've learned anything from the sort of conservative movement. Things often seem to go multiple cities, up to state. I'm curious if you're thinking about, if you're seeing anything in our particular arena, if you're seeing anything, or thinking about strategies that start at the city level, because my city is asking me for things of that nature, and I think California is sort of a prime state to do
Right.
that kind
Right.
of,
Yes.
that kind of model.
Yeah.
So I'd be curious to know what y'all are thinking.
We'll cover that.
Yeah, we're definitely going to dive into that, and we're actually going to look at it from a couple of levels. Number one, what you can do given what your state law says, because we have people from different states in the room, and there's going to be different kind of, in quotes, rules of the road, depending on the state you're in. We're also going to look at it from the legislative and the regulatory perspective, because there's sort of those two pieces. And then also considering to a certain degree whether you're a state where you have state franchising like we have here in California, or we have local franchising. And Chad, your point is really interesting to me, because when you're in a state that has state franchising, okay, where's the sweet spot for the local governments and localism to engage to help move things, okay, at the state level? So we're definitely going to dive into that. Mike.
So, I don't know if you're going to be concentrating on this or this is something that we run into. We've seen this in New York a little bit. I think you're going to see this you might see this in California and some other states, as there are lobbying efforts to support local journalism and confusion about community media. Because particularly as it is described specifically in some jurisdictions as ethnic media. So I don't know if this happens, if it's more of a question, this is something you're all monitoring, but I'm beginning to see it in a couple states as you see coalitions are either coming together for journalism support. And I think there's an open question about whether or not they're open to supporting nonprofits, and whether or not there's an opening or a coalition.
You know, what's interesting about that question and the fact that the coalition with journalism, but think about a few years back when nobody really wanted to recognize community media as an important player, but it was all about broadband. It was all about media and digital literacy. It was all about giving people access to the internet and so on and so forth. That, just like this piece, that bubbled up, and now it's important, but it's sort of, I don't want to say leveled off, and now this other piece is bubbling up. So it's fascinating to watch these trends happen and then figure out where they're going to ultimately land, essentially, and who are going to be the key players when they land. It's at times I find it annoying for those of us who are really committed to community media and know it has a big umbrella, okay? That somehow this sort of siloing happens, okay? And we see that even at the local government level, okay? We see departments aren't sharing information between each other. We see in communities are siloed by particular interest areas or whatever, and not looking at what we all have in common, what we need to do to accomplish what we have in common, okay? And sometimes the way to come at what you're talking about is in part trying to get people, like this morning, the conversation was very, very interesting from that exact perspective, because I think people began to see what we have in common, okay, and where people are really going and thinking about that.
Yeah, you know, I haven't really seen those coalitions yet, at least in the states that I've been working in. I do a lot of work, obviously, in Minnesota, since that's my home state, but we do work in other states as well. Haven't seen that so much. It'd be interesting to know that they're out there and that they'd be potential partners. They maybe also be potential
Yes.
opposition, you know, depending on how that goes. But your comments reminded me of something else, and that is, you know, when you start going to state legislatures, and even when you go to kind of to Chad's comment to your city that you may be serving. A lot of times policymakers have no idea how you're funded. Mm-hmm. Zero, actually. Mm-hmm. And that's a problem, and or a challenge, I guess. You can overcome that easily enough by just doing some basic education, but you're starting from a very basic, spot where they don't know how you're funded, and they have no idea that our funding is changing significantly from over the last, 6 or 7 years. We've had legislators say, "What's the problem? You're funded like PBS."
Yeah.
That's what he really thought, and I don't think he was alone. Mm-hmm. So we do have that educational piece to raise as well when we're talking about funding and talking about partners and things.
Somebody just earlier today was saying how they had gone in to meet with somebody about what the media center was doing and so on and so forth, and in fact that they're doing primarily public meetings, and the local elected official go, "Well, isn't that, that's just a hobby, right? Right? It's it just happens. It's a hobby. It's not really a serious thing, and so on and so forth." The person had absolutely no framework frame to understand that meeting that they want to have and they want to get out, okay, doesn't come because it comes with no money. It doesn't realize it takes resources to do it. It's important to what they want. But again, going to your point, they had no idea whatsoever how it happened. Just that it happens and they want it to happen, and that's about it. Mm-hmm. And that kind of leads us right into one of the things we were going to start to talk a little bit about, and that is the whole is cable TV dead? All right. and then moving really on to talk a little bit about the impact. One of the things that over the last 40 or 50 years, PEG access and community media has dealt with is that there's always a challenge and there's always a threat. And one of the things that we have always had to concentrate on is how are we going to stay around? How are we going to make it the next year through with funding? We really have to take a much longer perspective on this. We've got to look at longevity. We have to anticipate the challenges that are going to come at us before they ever come at us. Because in some cases, if you anticipate them and you plan for them, all right, they won't come at you, or if when they do come, you are so well prepared that the impact of that challenge is far, far less than it might otherwise have been.
Does everybody, by the way, does everybody recognize this scene? I've come to
Yeah.
the point in my career now where I realize that I use scenes from old movies that now people don't understand. But Monty Python, I figure Monty Python and the Holy Grail
Yeah.
still works. Does it still work for you? Okay. The bring out your dead scene. Bring out your dead, and the guy's like, "I'm not dead yet. I think I'll go for a walk." Anyway, I think it's a nice way of, well, I don't know, nice, but it shows that I think a lot of people are thinking, well, cable's completely gone, and our response to that collectively is it's not dead yet. We shouldn't be quick to throw cable onto the cart. And that cable is still, very much alive. And this next slide that Sue put up still shows that. Now it shows a big dip. Don't get me wrong, but even with that dip, what it shows is that in 2010 there was 54 million cable subscriptions in 2010, and now it's 36 points. Oh no, I'm sorry, that's cable revenue. So $54 billion of cable revenue.
Yeah.
Okay, well that's a big number. But now it's 36.75, so somewhere around $35 billion. That's still a big number. It's still a big number. So is cable dead yet? No. And we can go to the next slide too.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the cause of the decline. Okay, the cause of the decline in cable revenues. And so, Jeff, you want to share a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, I'll keep it quick because I think this is a story a lot of you are familiar with. But with cord cutting, people moving to online streaming, different forms of entertainment, kind of not the same as much of a unified media, we've seen cable going down. And of course, the big problem with that is under cable franchises, the revenue's tied specifically to cable services. Not all of the money that the operator's making, not all the money they're making from operating the cable system in the public rights of way, but just the cable services. So even as these companies see their, internet and broadband revenue increase as it's flowing over the same wires, that's not helpful in terms of funding municipalities, funding community media centers through cable fees, because those are linked to cable revenue.
Well, and if one of you guys could address also the reality of the difference in states and how that cable revenue, the franchise fees or the PEG fees actually are used. It's not only state franchising versus local franchising, but it's also the state laws vary a little bit with regard to who gets the money.
They can, for sure. They can. But, franchise fees generally can be used for any purpose a city decides to use it for. And that pretty much goes across
Except for
the country.
Massachusetts.
Yeah, except for Massachusetts. So, anyway, your franchise fees are declining, but the franchise fees are typically the fees that help fund access television. At least that's the way it's been for 40 years. And then you have PEG fees. Now, PEG fees are a little bit different, right? Because there are restrictions, federal, and then maybe even some state restrictions on PEG funding. Yes.
Mike, I don't love the slide, but I love the slide. But one of the things I would be kind of curious about in terms of telling a policy story that might be useful at the state level would be to have an overlay with total video dollars spent.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So while this is useful, this doesn't tell the story of total dollars being spent over public property.
Right. And that's
And I think
absolutely,
That's where the battle
yes.
has to lie.
Yeah.
So if we can, I mean, so I know you've got a large team working on your graphics.
Yes,
And
it's a team of, it's a team of one.
Around the
Yes.
clock they're working, the
Yes.
snowy climes.
Yeah.
But that might be really useful is telling a single story in terms of where the consumer dollar is going and how we are seeing diminished public benefit.
Yes.
Yeah, and
Mike
it's-
Wassenaar is a mind reader, by the way, so
Yeah.
we're gonna talk about that too.
And it's super important to emphasize these are the same wires. It's the same property of the people. Exactly. The cord's not being cut. The cord is like being shifted slightly or moved. And if we let a whole sector collapse just because of that kind of a shift, which almost always happens with time, then we're being a little bit myopic and sort of looking at, a dictionary meaning of words instead of the spirit with which the law was passed. And also in California, I will throw in, we now have a $15 billion investment in middle mile internet broadband and last mile
Yep.
broadband, meaning that we now, as taxpayers, have literally put money into building out the broadband network. So there is a growing case that at least under some circumstances, the broadband networks are also public property through which private corporations are raising money by delivering services over those networks, which are starting to be built more and more with public money, with taxpayer money, with our money.
So as we sort of move into this next phase that we're going to talk a little bit about, okay, it's sort of like as we look at the different states, okay, and we look at the very fact that Tracy has brought up, i.e., there's a lot of money being made off that same wire, and because of, to a certain degree, because of federal law, it's siloed, okay, and then sometimes because of state law, it's siloed, all right. But another piece just to throw in here before we kind of go to the legislative options, which is something we wanted to talk about this afternoon, is to realize some of you may or may not know what goes into what you call the franchise fee, what I call a franchise fee basket. Okay. Now we know we can't get the internet dollars and whatever into the franchise fee basket.
Yes.
But just so you understand, it's not just cable, how much you pay for your cable, okay? But it's how much is spent on home shopping. It's advertising revenue. There's a whole lot of other revenues. Now, they may not make up a significant portion of what that franchise fee is, or if your PAG support that's separate from franchise fees is calculated based on a percentage of gross revenue, that what goes into that gross revenue basket. But these are some things that a lot of people don't, who work on our field don't, unless you do auditing, unless you really understand how these pieces all come together, it really is easy to get to miss a real key point here. Another key point in this, and these guys are going to talk about it here in a little bit, is so you've got certain services that run on the cable system, on the cable wire, that are considered cable services, called video services. But then there are other things that run there. They're even offered by the cable company as they try to bump people off of cable that are the same things. So at least why shouldn't those things, those services that appear both places and where the company is selling essentially a broadband package, be at least part of the franchise fee? All right. So this whole arena is one of the things that as we look at legislative options and different approaches to take, all right, we're starting to look at it and we're actually starting to see various states kind of go down this path. And I know we've got a slide up here right now that kind of lays out the legislative options, but I'm going to turn it over to these three people to kind of pick which one you want to talk to, or you want to talk about them all. And we've got, and what's happening in certain states with regard to these things.
So I'd like to see a show of hands of those of you who are working on state legislation right now in your states. Hawaii, maybe, yeah, Hawaii. Okay. So I would just suggest that this needs to become really a bigger priority for cities in particular, but also for access organizations, and for access organizations to be working with their city partners. And you're starting to see that more and more now. It's been especially present in the Northeast. So you can see on the slide the different ways that some of these organizations, some of these municipal organizations and access centers have really been working through these issues. So Vermont it's I think still looking positive for general fund funding of about $1 million for access organizations.
Give you a quick update. They are working on a 3-year projection for a general fund obligation that ramps up each year.
Good.
So this year, they're looking at 1.7.
Oh, it's gone up a little bit.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Good.
So,
Yeah.
let's give folks a little bit of a background on Vermont. And Jeff, maybe if you could share a little bit about the Vermont scenario, because it's been kind of interesting compared to a lot of them.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of a lesson ongoing with these is a lot of these are multi-year efforts that have different phases. So Vermont earlier, if I'm remembering right, there's legislation that commissioned a study that they were going to look into how access centers were funded, the challenges they're facing, different options for how to address those kind of shortcomings. And I think even that was not an instantaneous process, but that led to kind of the legislature paying attention into some of these issues, into looking into it. And now we see, in some ways the simplest approach is allocation from the general fund. The state has money they can choose to fund in different places. Now the challenge there is that there's no new money coming in, right? So it has to come from somewhere, and there are trade-offs. But you see when there's that kind of ongoing effort, there's that education, and that can be built into the law, them looking at it. You can see those results.
I go a step farther. That funding they got for that white paper, they did because they did yearly Hill Days in Montpelier. So step one, Hill Day at the Capitol.
At your state capitol? At your
Correct.
state capitol?
Step
Yes.
one. MAC will be doing it next week.
Yes.
Right? So
Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and we'll see, we have another slide a little later. In Maine, they have some recent legislation out on funding, but that's also building off of years in litigation of some legislation just aimed at fair treatment of access channels.
Yeah, whenever anybody says that this can't be done, that legislation benefiting PEG can't be done, the answer is that's incorrect. It can be done. It often takes years, and we're at the point where we don't have a lot of years, in my opinion, and we need to get going on these efforts because it does take a while. And Maine has been very, very good because they've had a really good group, and Maine's a great example because it's really access organization driven, and they have just done a fantastic job of developing relationships with legislators and getting bipartisan support.
And this does get back to Mike's point about cable not being dead, not just in there being a share, there still is significant cable revenue that goes into fees, but there are also ongoing issues with cable service, and that can kind of be an entryway that's a somewhat lower bar than just, a streaming tax going after the Netflix of the world. And I think we were involved, with ACM and ACD in helping defend in the district court and in the First Circuit these laws from challenges. But it really was a year build-up. There was also an a la carte bill that really focused attention on these cable issues that I think led to these more recent franchise reforms, which pulls in, those affiliated with the cable operators, Peacock, Zumo, into the scope of the franchise and the fees in this most recent law in 2024.
Go back up to the other.
Yeah, go ahead, Tracy.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump off a bit from where Chad was going in terms of, how do we build this kind of from the ground up, from the local level sort of to the state level? Because I think anybody will tell you, and for those of you who have been involved with ACM public policy in the West know, because we already went to the state once and kind of got our behind handed to us, but you have to build power, right? And so the question here is sort of, okay, we need money to sustain our operations. Like, who are our natural allies that would also care that this happens. Like, who are our partners here? And we have to kind of widen the frame, because while people probably would prefer that we sustain our operations, it's like, where's their skin in the game? And I think that our partners here realistically are the other entities that are benefiting from the franchise fees. And who is that? Local governments, right? Because whatever percentage of those fees come to PEG, the rest of those fees support the general fund and all of the services that the city or county provides. So I think where the challenge is here is, how do we mobilize our local governments to understand that we have to get the faucet turned on, that we have a dripping spigot here, it's dripping less and less water, we're being defunded, but they're being defunded too, and there's a plethora of strategies, like we can see on the card, for how we could potentially refill those coffers, but that we have a shared investment in getting that done. And yes, it probably does mean some kind of state level action. The city of San Jose itself cannot refill those coffers, but the city of San Jose can say, it's really important that this happens. It benefits our city and all of its residents. And yes, it keeps our community media center funded, which is important to us, but it also does this, this, and this. And we, the city, we need these funds too. So you got to figure out some source for these funds to compensate for the funds that are being lost because of cord cutting. Because this is a downward trajectory. It's gone down substantially. It's going to keep on going down, and we are being defunded as we speak. And what are you going to do about it, state of California, or whatever state you're in? So I really recommend that when you talk to your city folks, that you talk about this defunding that is impacting both of you, and how you can work together to help the state basically change course.
I think that's a really good point. You know, when you're talking, when you start talking to city managers, a lot of times they will have no idea about your funding issues. And really, again, they don't really have a good understanding of how you're funded to begin with. But when you start talking to them about budgets and what's happening to your budget and what needs to happen moving forward, in my experience, they get it. And that's the start of moving forward with state or city support that ultimately leads up to state support.
So could you guys take a look at this? We've got sort of 4 different kind of approaches or ways in the door, okay? Maybe for everybody in the room, just what is a general fund obligation? What is a gross earnings tax? You know, just the basic principles behind each of those. And then as needed, we can dive into where that's been tried. Because I think that that's something that we all are not necessarily, it's not a language we speak a lot of the times. So I would just throw that out to the
I can give 30 seconds. And I think in going through these two, kind of tying Mike and Tracy's point, some of these have more natural allies than others. And that's something to think about when you're thinking about what of these might be worth pursuing. So general fund obligation, we talked a little bit about, that's the state saying, you know, from our general fund, we're going to allocate some certain amount to these people. Could be PEG access, could be for a year or some set amount of years. Gross earnings tax, that would just be an overall tax on the earnings. I think it's something like 2% from certain of the companies that go towards PEG support. I'm not sure if it's exclusively PEG support. The streaming video tax is interesting, and there's some variations among these, but that's kind of, in some ways I don't want to say franchise fee, because it depends on whether you're tying it to the rights of way or not, and not all of these necessarily are, like New York, but just an excise tax on 5% of the revenue from streaming services. And then New York, for instance, I think it's divvied up similar, at least in earlier versions of the Massachusetts law, yes, with 40% going towards community media, 40% to local governments, and that gets to who's being hit by the decline in cable revenue, and 20% for the state, which gets the state interested. But New York, has some provisions in there on what happens in localities where there isn't community media and a commission to provide that money to some other organizations. And you could see variations of that getting into, allied groups if it's going to journalism or not. Concern is also, you've seen efforts from, I think it was the Transit Authority, to have similar taxes, to fund their budget shortfalls. And then broadband franchising, another big thing, is, aside from the cable operators, or in addition to the cable operators, broadband companies that have their facilities in the rights of way and should be subject to similar franchising requirements for use of these public resources.
Now, Mike, you've been involved in a number of these bills, particularly in Minnesota, if I remember right.
Yes, and I wrote the Equal Access to Broadband Act. It's brilliant, by the way.
I'm going to pop up there because I think we have a summary of it here. So the
well,
different approaches.
in Minnesota, we have a number of different approaches, and somebody up here mentioned that that's not a bad thing. And we need to be a little flexible. I think Jeff said it actually when we were talking about Vermont, and it's true. Vermont had multiple approaches, and then they kind of landed on this general fund obligation thing. But Minnesota, we looked at Equal Access to Broadband Act. We looked at a streaming tax. We looked at another type of streaming tax called the local digital media tax. And we have another one now that we just introduced, House File 1740. And it's to dedicate, this is kind of a fun bill actually. You can imagine yourself in your various states thinking about this, but it's a bill that will dedicate a certain amount of money from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. And what makes it kind of fun, besides getting money, is it will go to it'll go to a group called MACTA, who will administer the funds for the access organizations. So MACTA is kind of like ACM West, if you will. Yes.
So I want to add on a couple quick thoughts.
Yeah.
First, we should be, I feel bad about this, we should be distributing Lee Shaker and Dr. Antoine Haywood's
Yes.
paper from last year on the digital taxation of goods to support community media work across the United States. We should be having that in every state.
And what else?
You know,
And what else?
there's a bunch of other things.
No,
Which one?
the one that's related to me.
Yes, okay. Second thing I was going to say that I think is useful about the new bill that's coming out and you'll be talking about next
Yeah.
week, according to Karen George. Still means the policy call that happened up in
Yes.
upstairs in my room
Yes.
last hour, is that the Heritage Fund, people should know about because that's a half-cent sales tax on all goods in Minnesota that was put together by a coalition of hunters and arts groups.
Mm-hmm.
So the suggestion I would make to everybody is to be thinking about the thing that Chad talked about, is what the coalition is building power for local investment in communities. In Minnesota, it was a conservative and liberal coalition that put together that fund, which I can't remember how much it generates on a yearly basis now. But you're looking at an appropriation from that fund that already exists. So
Right.
You don't have to make the tax case. You're making the case about where the investments are happening for Minnesota good, based upon an agreed upon investment that already exists.
Right.
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 And I think there's an object lesson about that because it's an easier discussion to have than just liberals talking about taxes. Because I know we've got a number of partners in states that are having a hard time thinking about how you have the conversation if it's just 2 or 3 cities that want to raise a tax revenue for something that benefits just them.
Yeah, I think you're right about that, and with that new bill in Minnesota, we actually have bipartisan support as well, which is kind of huge, especially now that the majority has changed in Minnesota. So you're right about that. The other article that I was talking about was the municipal lawyer article on broadband franchising. Only half joking, really. That I wrote an article for the municipal lawyer on municipal broadband, and it gives really all the reasons why you should be supporting it and all the reasons why the opposition is wrong. So take a look at that when you have a moment.
So it's really important to kind of get your hands around this. What we're trying to do right now is to give you a sense of what the options are, the approaches are. In a few minutes, we're going to talk about the process, okay? But I want to get a couple more things in about the various approaches. And Jeff and Mike have sort of laid out the sort of 4 or 5 different approaches if you're going to go a legislative approach, okay? There's another approach, and again, this idea of having taking multiple cracks, bites at the apple, so to speak, and figuring out which is going to work for you. And Vermont is a classic example of looking at a lot of different approaches. In Vermont, one of the approaches that was looked at was a pole attachment fee.
Yes.
Okay? Which is pole attachment fee, but it was an interesting approach. They ultimately landed on something different, but that's what we have to keep our minds open to. But in order to keep our minds open to it, we have to even know it's an option. Now, another thing is the regulatory approach. And that is a little bit different. If you're in a state, for instance, and I'll use California as a good example, okay, where you have state franchising, and you might start to take small bites out of the apple by working with the regulatory agency that has any say over cable. So in California, that's the California Public Utilities Commission, okay? And what can the CPUC do? Well, the CPUC can oversee customer service, as an example, and maybe a few other things. But Tracy, would you tell us a little bit about what Media Alliance, ACM, and ACD have been doing on that front, taking one bite at a time, because we got slapped down when we tried to do a state bill a couple of years ago.
Yes, we did. We don't want to have too much post-traumatic stress syndrome about all of that, but just to give sort of a comparison, because I think one process is one where we've gotten traction and one where we haven't gotten where we didn't get traction. And so it's probably a little bit helpful to kind of see the difference. So one of the things that, it has been an ongoing problem for California PEGs is the whole issue of having our transmissions that are recorded in HD downgraded by the cable companies, often Comcast and Charter, and sent over the air in standard in SD, where the captions get crunkled and there's black boxing and things don't look the way that they should. So we thought, well, this is kind of an easy fix. All we're really asking is that the cable companies stop degrading and literally like downgrading signals and broadcast them in the same format that they're being sent to them, right? We can fix this on the state level. So we went and we found an author and we got a bill. And the reality is, because we didn't have a really strong coalition behind it, when the bill got to the assembly floor, it literally died from lack of votes. And it was sort of an example of the fact that if you jump ahead of the coalition and power building part straight to the legislation, you're not going to get the result that you're looking for, because state legislatures are places where bills go to die. I mean, that's what it is. And so you can't neglect the power building part of it. And we're going to very much try to focus on that in our public policy committee. So we are hoping that you all will join us in that kind of effort, because it is a multi-year effort to develop strong enough partnerships and a strong enough base to then go to the state and say, give us what we want, because we're potent enough that you need to really listen to us seriously and not just sort of string us along for a while and then kill our bill. By contrast, at the California Public Utilities Commission, there was a sort of kind of a lukewarm bill that just kind of passed that basically was talking about adopting customer service standards for cable. Literally one sentence, and it was sort of handed off to the CPUC to kind of do that. And of course, the cable company swept in and said, we already have customer service standards. You don't have to do anything. But we sort of at ACM and Media Alliance and ACD took a look at this and thought, well, customer service standards can mean a whole lot of things, right? It can mean almost everything about how an operation interacts with its customers, and that what we're doing, which is offering community benefits to those subscribers, really is customer service. So this encompasses how they treat us and how they make it possible for us to treat their subscribers and the surrounding community. So we sort of went in there and tried to convey that the term customer service needed to be broad, not kind of narrow, and that we needed to take a kind of holistic view and not do this sort of reductive customer service just refers to a couple of things, but sort of look at the whole package. And we were successful in keeping the definition of customer service pretty widely scoped. We were successful in saying, let's have public participation hearings so we can hear from people, so you're not just sitting here in this room reading these long briefs from cable lawyers all day long. Like, let's bring some fresh air into the room. So they scheduled 6 public participation hearings, which is a whole bunch. And we were successful in bringing people to those hearings. Probably there are some people in this room who went to 1 or 2 of them. I know there are. But we were, capable of bringing people into the room to talk to them and to say, this impacts us. These aren't just, what's the word? This isn't just abstract, and this isn't just people being mad because their cable prices are going up. There's more to it than that. And so we're still waiting to get sort of the outcome. Like, I've taken in all of this input, and we're going to have to see how it registered and what kind of output we get. So the jury's still out on like how effective all of this was.
Preliminary feedback?
Sorry?
A lot of us in California took part in those.
Yeah.
Any kind of a reading of the tea leaves on?
We're waiting. We're waiting.
Nothing?
All the input has happened. We are waiting for the output. And, everything I'm saying is contingent on, we think it worked, but we have to kind of see what comes out as the sort of preliminary output.
Certainly there was a lot of feedback given in those hearings.
Absolutely, but they took in much more than they expected. And as we went through it, we kept up that, broad view of customer service argument. And it seems like we, at least through this first part, have been kind of successful in getting them to see it the way that we wanted to see it, which is sort of a holistic, community-first approach. And one that, stands up for the importance of these community benefits as a really important part of the whole package of cable service. And the other thing to say is that there is a process where community stakeholders can go to the CPUC and say, well, you're not starting this process, but we would like you to do a rulemaking on X. And while they don't have to say yes, they can. And so part of what we were thinking that we might develop is a petition around, for example, a streaming,
Right.
expanding the franchise fees to include streaming activities. And that maybe this is something we would say, we want you to do our process on this. We want you to have a rulemaking, talk about these issues, drag the cable companies in, make them defend themselves. And so that is a part of the way that we're thinking that we can potentially expand our efforts in California and use this process to have the regulatory agency do more than they would probably do if we never said anything to them.
Tracy, is there a portal or a mechanism for that? Because after those initial hearings, I had a bunch of people just in our area that wanted to take part, and I didn't know what to tell them because the portal to submit comments was done, and we just couldn't find anything again. I didn't know what to tell people.
There's an interval. It's closed for now. We will be getting what they call a preliminary staff decision. That means, how they responded to all the input that they've gotten so far. Once they deliver that, and it was supposed to be the fourth quarter of 2024, it hasn't come, we're in the first quarter of 2025, so we're waiting. But once it comes, there will be the portal will open up once again, and there will be a comment opportunity.
Yeah.
And so, yes, ACM West
So
will.
right now, there's no mechanism.
No,
No.
you have to wait. We're
to wait.
just in that period. And ACM West will let you all know when that comment period opens up again. And as we said, we want to work on this petition that says, you did this, this was good, now do more.
Yeah. And sometimes it is like Maine did too. It's a couple of bites at the apple. I mean, they started out with one bill that got passed that dealt with HD and several things. It didn't deal with funding, okay? And then they've taken another step. So as we look at how we move forward to craft state legislation, I also think we have to simply keep this regulatory pathway in mind, because sometimes it gets lost in the mix of trying to figure out how to write legislation. And yeah, Jeff, I could see your...
Well, it's another theme. It's a similar education process.
Yeah.
Like, I think having gone through this, you know, ACM, ACD, ACM West are a better position to come in with additional asks.
Yeah.
Having made those connections. And it was actually at this conference a couple years ago
Exactly.
on a similar panel that a CPU staffer was here talking about this initiative that they were starting in order to get public input, and that kind of built the relationship that I think made them more receptive to the public participation hearings, working on getting, you know, really making a concerted effort to get the word out to encourage that. So it's a multi-year process, but building those relationships and educating people on these issues.
So there's one theme here for just a minute. It's the education part. You guys are all talking about it with regard to, but we have to look at our local elected officials as well. That if they in fact are our key partners in moving forward on any kind of a legislative thing, number one, as Mike was saying, why should they care? Well, they should care. They should care because it's going to impact the money that their budget issues that are really pulling them down, in part because of the cable, but in part because of other things. So if it's in their best interest, again, this is about this education piece, and that's part of what we did with the CPUC process, but it was just with a state agency.
And one more thing when we're talking about allies, just because it hooks into the morning plenary kind of neatly, another sector out there that is desperately looking for funding because their existing funding mechanism has broken down is local news. Especially local nonprofit news, which is what local news is kind of turning into. They are also in an existential battle for funding because advertisers are gone, right? That's not happening. And we have a lot of shared imperatives in many ways, as we saw with, you know, Fresno Land and the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative. We kind of want to serve the same audiences for some of the same purposes. So if there are things that we can work together on that would unlock revenue that could benefit both groups, then hey, there's an ally with skin in the game. So these are, you know, in addition to cities and counties. So these are ways to kind of, the more the revenue pie hits other sectors, the more allies and the bigger a coalition we're gonna have.
So Sue and Tracy should be really commended for their hard work at the CPUC. I'm sure you can all appreciate that. And I think what Tracy was alluding to is there probably is another process that you should at least be looking at for rulemaking at the CPUC, and that's on whether or not video programming delivered by streaming is a cable service under the California, the DIVCA law. Now, let me explain why I think that all of you in California and elsewhere are being underpaid in franchise fees. The DIVCA law has a state franchise fee. The state franchise fee is paid to local governments, and then that's divvied out as the city deems appropriate. A lot of it comes to access organizations. The state franchise fee is an up to 5% fee on the gross revenues derived from cable service or video service. Cable service is defined as video programming. Video programming is defined as programming like broadcast programming, okay? So when you look at the streaming services that are being delivered by cable operators or video operators over their systems, and I use my friends at Comcast the most because it's the easiest. They are delivering multiple products over their cable system that they claim are not cable services. They are cable services, okay? And you don't have to look far for them. Peacock. Okay, when you watched the Olympics last summer, what did you watch? You watched NBC broadcast programming, right? Or on Peacock, right? I watched the Premier League. I have a problem. Where do you watch it? Oh, Mike knows my team.
Wait, where do you watch the Premier League?
Where do you watch it? NBC,
Oh, it isn't. Okay.
NBC, or Peacock, or USA Network. Okay, so now let me give you a first-hand experience that I just had. I called up my yearly call to Comcast to lower my bill. Okay, I'm paying $260. I know I was getting ripped off. So I said, I'm paying too much. Mike, we have the perfect solution for you. Really? How would you like to pay, instead of 260, 140? I'm listening. And I said, well, what's going to change? Nothing's going to change. You're going to have sports channels, you're going to have news channels, everything. Well, that sounds good. So what did they do? Without saying a word of how they were going to do this, I took the deal because I was super curious. Now I have buyer's remorse, but they switched me. This is the point of the story. They switched me from a service that they pay cable franchise fees on to a service that they claim is not cable service called Xumo. Xumo provides broadcast channels. It's video programming. It's a cable service or video service under your state law in California. That is gross revenue from cable service. They should be paying franchise fees on it. The California PUC should clarify that that's the case. That's my argument. So if I'm in California and I'm sitting in your chairs, I am figuring out how to get a big coalition together to work together through ACM or otherwise on making at least figuring out if this is a viable possibility. Because if it is, it would be tremendously important to your cities, and more importantly for this room, to all of you.
And just so you know, Comcast is ramping up national ads, you see them all the time, for strictly streaming services, bundled streaming services that are basically analogous to cable the way that they're bundling them. It's just that they're not making franchise.
Yep. And what they will say is, because I do this daily, what they say is, oh, Mike, this is not a cable service. This is an internet information service. We only sell it to our internet subscribers. And my response is, I don't care who you sell it to. You have a cable system. You are providing the video programming over that system. It's a cable service.
Go for it. You had your head now.
Well, another way to view that is that the services that you get through your cable box.
Yes.
Yeah, that you can get to Amazon Prime, Netflix, Peacock.
Yes.
Through your cable box.
Yes.
Watching on your TV.
Yes.
You navigate with your cable remote.
Yeah. Yeah. I didn't even mention that.
It's a simple.
The cable operators are making money multiple ways. Not only selling their own video programming,
And the box
right?
you have to pay for it.
But they sell third-party services too, right? Because I didn't tell you that part of my deal. I got Apple TV and Netflix, all provided over the cable system, and all, and my guess is, Comcast doesn't just sell that stuff and not keep a huge portion of it.
Yeah,
So,
like ad revenues.
I know what community you live in too. So have you talked to the franchise administrator in that community?
Yes.
Okay. Because this is a complaint that I've been raising as well. We both are raising this.
Yes.
I don't know of a single municipality that's taken a bite at the apple on this in over 18 months. Charter and Comcast announced their partnership to Screw America. I'm sorry, name something else. Over 18 months ago, I just got a notification as an RCN customer in Silver Spring, Maryland, that DirecTV will be acting as a Sumo product in partnership with internet suppliers, basically to provide what is essentially cable television. I've told my cable administrator in Montgomery County, Maryland, about this, but I did not see cities actually doing anything. Why is that?
Well,
You got-
not all cities, yeah, not all cities.
We need to circle back to
It doesn't
state
matter.
action for this,
Yeah.
but
Right, right. Well, not all cities act quickly. The issue will come forward through typically a franchise review process. And then a lot of times the cable operator will make offers that the city decides to take. Also, the cities are litigation adverse.
Right.
And they
Yeah.
don't want to be the only entity going up against a multi-billion-dollar communications company. So when you look at, but yes, that's my point. In California, you've got a different, potentially
Structure.
a different place that you can go.
Yep.
And that's why you should be looking at it very seriously.
theoretically that'd be the case with other states as well.
There's a bunch of
Theoretically,
comments
yes.
and questions in the back.
The
over here.
argument, yeah, I mean, the argument for rulemaking is to do something before it breaks out into
Yeah.
litigation, right?
Right.
And avoid all that.
Randy, and then this gentleman back here in the
No,
corner.
not in California.
California and Sacramento, we've got a pretty interesting case. I don't know what our government has done about it. But we had an overbuilder of Comcast for many years that put fiber to the home. It was a great service. And then they decided to get out of the cable business and instead encouraged us to either take YouTube TV or DirecTV. And they got out of the cable type of business. So there's the example there. I wonder, Zach, I wonder what the cable commission is doing about that. So I presume that's quite a potentially a lot of franchise fees. Also, you used the magic phrase there, Mike, when you said Internet Information Service. That goes back to the case that caused all of our problems many years ago, where, because prior to that case that came out of Portland, right, that internet revenues that we were paying were part of the franchise fee, and then it got taken away because it's an information services. Did that case absolutely define what this is? Because I'm sorry, Netflix is not an information service.
Well,
YouTube TV is not an information service. What's the definition that we could go
That's-
with to go battle this thing?
well,
That's the
I
whole
think.
Title II, Title I.
Yeah.
War.
Well,
writ large.
Randy, yeah, I mean, your point's well taken. But, frankly, I don't mind that it's an information service, that broadband is an information service. I think that opens a lot of avenues for local governments and states to take action, like with broadband franchising, for example. I think if broadband was a telecommunications service, like the FCC had tried to reclassify broadband as, the FCC, I could see particularly this FCC, would completely preempt local governments from franchising. So I think
Yeah.
it leaves some options open. You're right, it did start in Portland.
Dave Wilson's birthday was yesterday.
Yeah, and David Olson was behind it, and it resulted in, if I'm remembering my history, the FCC reclassified
Yeah.
broadband as an information service. It was upheld eventually on appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court in Brand X.
Yeah,
Yep.
historically,
Back then it made sense though, it truly was an information service. It was Google, it was
Yeah.
all that kind of stuff.
well,
Suddenly things have changed.
Well, yeah, and it was a big deal at the time when we're going back to, believe it or not, 2002.
historically,
And they were paying franchise fees. Cable companies were paying franchise fees on their internet
That's right.
products,
That's right.
and so it was a big deal at the time.
Tracy?
yeah. Historically, part of the problem is that the information services category, which is Title I, unlike Title II, which is more like common carrier or basic utility, the idea was that Title I was sort of exempt from any sort of governmental rate regulation. And generally, you know, franchise fees are a kind of rate regulation. They affect the prices of things. So that's the consequences that Title I, Title II classification can often have. Now, the interesting thing is that New York recently passed a law to cap the price of internet service companies, broadband companies, had to provide an affordable internet option for people that were poor of a maximum of $15 a month, which is considerably less than most of them would choose to charge. And the ISPs fought that all the way to cert at the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court failed to overturn a lower court ruling that, in fact, rate regulation could be applied to broadband and ISP companies, because essentially the FCC and the federal government hasn't stepped into the plate and said, we're going to do it, so the states are preempted. They basically are just saying, well, nobody's going to do it. And in that case, the court concluded, well, if the states want to, they can, because the feds have basically vacated the playing field. They've chosen not to regulate in this area, which was sort of, you know, turning the old stuff on its head. But what it suggests is that rate regulation for broadband in various ways, writ large, is now something that is potentially on the policy table. And that's why it can be one of the choices.
Yeah, not only is it on, it's being used, and it was just used by the state of not just, 3 years ago, used by the state of New York in passing the Affordable Broadband Act.
Mm-hmm. So it's
When it was a Title I service.
Yeah.
And guess what? It was upheld on appeal.
So
that's an
Yeah.
example of
Yeah.
states filling in
So
when it's a Title I service.
aspirational, but the idea that broadband services could be regulated in this way as franchises that pay franchise fees isn't like completely impossible, is all.
And just remember this too, and we'll get to, I was talking
He's
about
back
breakfast too. But remember this too. Local governments had been franchising cable operators since the 1960s, right? Maybe even as far back as the late 1950s. But for sure in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s. When was the Cable Act? When was Title VI created?
Oh,
1984.
yeah.
What was cable defined as before Title VI? It was a Title I information service.
Right.
I rest my case.
Back here and then. You had to get that in. Yeah.
So it's been interesting to be part of this process. I'm from a very small market. From the standpoint of we're talking 6,200 square miles, 3,000 people, that's it in that county. The question is that I've gone to our city councils or our cities and asked them for franchise agreements. First of all, I don't even know if some of these folks even know that they have a franchise agreement. And it was so far back when it was done that it doesn't actually, I don't even think it actually spells out exactly what they need to do. Also, I'm from California, so therefore
There's no
the
franchise
California Public Utilities Commission. I know that all the franchise agreements are getting ready to expire in that county in 2027.
I'll check.
Which means that they're gonna have to go through the entire process, plus they have the entire cable company change from what they call normally cable to live broadband. So the question is that how does things like that, when they start to re-sign these stuff, then I'm trying to find, I'm not listening on this, so I've written all these things down. The question is that how do we educate our local governments? What is the common, when I say, I go to my local government and I say, this is what's happening, I need to be speaking at a common level.
Yeah.
Everybody else in the state or across the United States is talking to. So we need at least a primer from that standpoint to be able to talk.
Beautiful.
I appreciate it because he's actually been way to help us with that, with Sherry. But the thing is, I know we look forward to working with those committees.
Yeah.
That's the biggest thing is understanding that, having them to explain to them their franchise agreements, making sure that it actually spells out exactly what they're looking for as well. So those kind of things. Anyway, that's what.
So we have to make something really clear for California. There are no longer local franchise agreements. The way, when DIFCO went into place in 2007, basically that's the state law that said, okay, The entity that's going to deal with franchises in California is going to be the CPUC, okay? It said if you had a local franchise at that time, it could stay in place until its natural ending would have been. Or in fact, the cable company could have come in certain situations and basically through a process rolled that non-expiring local franchise over to a state agreement. Okay, except there's not really a state agreement. It's just they have to abide by state law. Okay, so number one, there are now, with a couple of rare exceptions I'm aware of in California, no city in California has a local franchise agreement. Therefore, there is no opportunity to sit down and negotiate with a cable operator like you can in Massachusetts or New York and in many, in 20-some other states. That authority was removed from local governments due to the Digital Infrastructure and Video Competition Act being passed in 2006 and going into place in 2007. I mean, it was a big loss, and there were a lot of local governments and ACM and whatever all involved. Now, there are a few places in the state, due to some very unique circumstances, where there are still local franchises in place. But when they do expire, or if they can expire, and these very few unique places have language which typically is tied to a settlement agreement of some sort, okay? And if the settlement agreement stays in place, the franchise stays in place because of the terms and conditions of the settlement agreement. So that's just something to just be real clear about it for California. Other states in this region aren't necessarily that way, but California is that way. Yeah.
So what is the mechanism for the cities to implement the PEG fee on top of franchise?
Okay. Again, this is California stuff.
It's in this.
We can talk about it later, but
Yeah, let me go through that later, but it's not a hard process, and let's. I think I want to keep us on track there, but grab me afterwards, and I'll walk you through it. It's because I've lived my life for 20 years dealing with educating people about this, and it's still something a lot of folks don't really know. Roger had his hand up and all over the place.
Kind of springboard off what he was saying, because I agree with him about what he's saying about the primer. I think
Yes.
we need to take all the experts in here and write something that is legally correct and also engineering correct for the last 40 years. Because there's a whole lot of the presumptions built into the words everyone uses. And if I go talk to a legislator who's 25 years old about what's happened, I need to tell the story in a very different way.
Yeah.
Yep.
I need to tell them, once upon a time, we didn't have cable. And then they came up with cable as the best way to move information. And so then we came up with this idea that if you're gonna run cable through the public right-of-ways, this is what you're gonna have to do to pay to the city or the state or whatever. And we have to tell the story out that way and then tell that 25-year-old legislator. And right now, they're using that same thing we came up with, and they're calling it different things, even though it's running down that same path.
Yeah.
And
Right.
they're saying, oh, we don't have to pay for this one because it's an electric car instead of a gas car. I don't know what to call it. You know, it's just got to be
Right.
simplified.
So it's
Okay.
essentially, it's a story of tax evasion or attempted tax evasion.
Exactly. And the fee thing is one other thing I want to talk about is technically, I think we need to make a story about the fact that they're collecting a fee. So the idea that somehow they're losing money, they're just collecting a fee on, like every retailer in Hawaii collects GET and then they send it to the tax office.
Right.
They don't think that GET is in their pocket.
And Roger, to your point, and to your point too, and I forgot your name, Dave. So Matt put together kind of their own handout, and that's why I threw it on that slide, is just to kind of give you an example of what you could do. And these slides will be available to you, so you can look at them, or just ping me and I'll send it to you. But it tells the story that they want told, at least at the local level at that state. And I could see Hawaii having their own, California, et cetera, having their own.
Because
kind
they
of
do,
handouts
they
like
do
that.
vary a bit from state to state, and that's real
they're
important
used
to
partly
understand.
for educating,
Yeah.
and they educate not only the legislators, but also some of their city decision makers as well.
Go.
I want to just add something to that part of that history.
I'm sorry.
That is, I think could really help benefit your discussion is this. I'm lucky enough to have been in this role beginning, I worked at a cable company that had a system manager that got, who was in the early days in the 40s in Wyoming. Here's some of the stories he told me about the role of government and how it made the business possible. There were many places where he would work and they would try to do the initial run of cable, where he and his crew got met by people with a shotgun in their face. Get the hell off my property. That's a story that they don't want to admit anymore, but it's exactly what happened. So many of the cable companies went to the government for help to make these public rights of way available to them. So that's why it all started. And he said, my God, I don't know what we'd have done without it. Look how this has changed. The attitude has changed among the industry because they realized that in the early days, it was a real pain for them to try to.
I've never heard that story.
Oh, yeah.
That's a good one.
Get the hell off. And even I heard stories of this happening when they were building in the 70s and the 80s. People said, no, you're not running cables through here.
Yeah, there's all kinds of help.
So I want to just riff a little bit and ask you a question of you, Mike. As you're dealing with bipartisan support of your work in Minnesota, how much does this question of like the use of public and private property for someone else's profit come up? If it comes up at all, because I think that's a sensitive question from like a property rights standpoint that I can see conservatives getting really torqued out about.
Yeah.
And further, I can see small government conservatives getting really torqued out about a multinational corporation getting like permanent access to use of public property and private property, basically to support, I don't know, whatever the hell they're doing there with their profits. So I was kind of curious about that because I get the sense that there's a conservative argument that pops up every once in a while. I'm not sure how dominant that is right now in a place like Minnesota.
Well, I can just tell you from the Equal Access to Broadband Act, that was a bill that would allow local governments to franchise broadband companies like they do cable operators. And then there was a special funding mechanism, not only to receive franchise fees, but also to receive an additional fee to support access television. And it was written to basically mirror what the support that we were receiving from cable operators from franchise fees. To your question, Mike, at least last year, I didn't feel like it was a big winning argument for me to be talking about the value of public property and the reasons why we needed to receive franchise fees. The opposition picked up on the franchise fees and really ran with it, and so maybe we should have gotten out ahead of that a little bit more. But really what I wanted to talk about was what are the values and how do you get equal access to broadband through franchising, and how do we use this opportunity to make sure that we're the guardrails when the federal government is going to spend, $670 million in that state on broadband. How is that investment going to be protected over the long haul? And my argument is that franchising would be that guardrail. Franchising allows you to do customer service. It makes it so that everybody receives the same quality of service no matter where they are in that jurisdiction, right? And it makes sure that it's built up fairly over time and pricing's fair over time. So I thought those were the strong points. It certainly resonated with at least a lot of Democrats. The Republicans, at least last year, the industry really got a hold of them and really got them fired up about fees and which they called taxes, and they called it a slush fund for cities. And so I think your point's well taken. I think we need to make sure that we're letting people know the message. I'm not sure that the message is going to be heard really well. That's why I wanted to focus on some of these other things about kind of, being good financial stewards of all this money, because not only were we putting all this federal money into broadband, but we were putting in additional state funding. The industry was also asking for tax breaks on broadband sales taxes. And so there was a lot of reasons why I thought that we could get some Republican support, and and we just didn't yet. But
So-
we'll see. It's reintroduced this session. We'll see what happens.
So we've been walking around and talking about pieces of the legislative process. This is a pretty nice little diagram. And I want to make sure we touch on, I know, a couple of other things that are popping up, and we'll go a little beyond our 3:30 thing, just so we can get everything covered. But let's talk about where do you start? Okay, in fact, we've talked about education.
Yes.
That's really the starting point. The issue of having education that's targeted to your state. You saw the Minnesota thing from MACTA. That was targeted to the state. Hawaii's education's going to be different. California's going to be a little bit different. I suspect Michigan's going to be a little bit different, okay? So putting together some simple tool, okay, that one can use, and also having, in the process of building that tools, building the coalition of people who are going to send the message. Chad, you're shaking your head and raising your hand.
Where are the tools and how are we on the ground supposed to develop those? It seems like we're not the policy, I mean, I've been here 20 years in policy
Yeah.
law in this area, but I'm going back to the beginning where I'm like, we need stuff from you all to be able to at least have these conversations.
Yes, you do.
Right?
Yeah.
Let me disagree with you just a little bit, Chad. I think the conversation starts right here, right
I
now,
agree.
with you. And you all have to decide this is something we want to do, or we think maybe we should do this.
Right.
Then you reach out to the Sues, the Mikes, the Jeffs, the Tracys, or whoever, and then decide, how are you going to strategically prepare yourselves? When are you going to get professional advice? When can we do things ourselves with our boots on the ground? But it starts here, and it starts with you. Yeah.
Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah. I agree. I'm going to push back a little bit too. That there are some common themes nationally, and
Yeah.
and to the point that a lot of this started decades ago, right? And legislators today, I don't think many of them have that connection anymore to know why franchising even exists.
Exists,
in the
yeah.
first place.
Correct.
We used to, at these conferences decades ago, talk a lot about the need and the value of carving out electronic green space for our communities, what that did for the communities, not just about protecting CMCs or
Right,
protecting the work
right.
we do or the good work we're doing, but the philosophy and value of why having this public interest obligation and carving out these spaces and having funding mechanisms is important and how that can build and improve our communities. And I don't think we have as much of that anymore. We talk a lot about why we need to protect. We don't talk about why it exists or why we even carved it out in the first place. And I don't think legislators have that background anymore to know, because and even on the local level, because local franchising has disappeared in many states. We're not even having those conversations.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and that's where once you decide you want to go a certain route, let's say you want to go the California PUC route, of course you're in Michigan, but or you want to go a legislative route, or you want to do both, whatever it is. I mean, if you decide to go to a legislative route, you're going to have to do that education piece, right? And so you're going to have to. You may, as collectively as a group, figure out some of these talking points, and then work with the Mike Wasseners of the world on making sure that you're getting out you're putting together a strong message that will resonate and educate decision makers. And I think it starts here, educating yourselves. I mean, you're here, that's kind of what you're doing. But then, figuring out, okay, we want to go a certain direction, okay, fine. Then you're going to have to go and talk to city policymakers, city partners, I think, maybe other partners. And, you know, Tracy and Jeff, please fill in, but that's where it starts, and you kind of build from there.
Two things.
Yeah, go in that, I gotta go.
Can I?
No, go.
Go?
And
Okay.
I'm thinking,
All right,
gotta
it's
say.
just traffic. Traffic management is important on a panel. So a couple of things. Chad, yeah, you're right. Materials are needed, and yes, the Public Policy Committee, the ACM West Board will create it. Have a little patience. We just had our second meeting, but by the 3rd or the 4th or the 5th, yeah, those should be in your hands. So fair enough. You're right. It is our responsibility to do that, and we're going to try to do that. I think there has been sometimes a lack of clarity about what exactly we wanted to do, and I think having a committee of the board is a way to kind of cut to the chase there and make some decisions. So yes. Second thing I wanted to say, left my mind. So let me say the third thing, and maybe the second thing will come back. I just wanted to let people know, because I just saw it, and I think that it's relevant. We talked about sort of what legislators think about these kinds of things and how we don't think that they understand this, and we don't think that they understand that, and we could be right, but there's always one way to find out, which is to listen to them. And there is actually, and we had talked about in the Public Policy Committee about trying to create something like this, but it already happened. In California, the Local Government Committee, which is the committee that deals with local governments, is actually having what they call an informational hearing, which is a couple of hours of let's get together and talk about these things, called Meeting the Moment, Strengthening Community Voices in Local Government Meetings. And that sounded just a little bit like it was up your guys' alley, like just a little. So I wanted to let people know that it was happening. It's March 19th at 9 a.m. in what they call the swing space, which is 1021 O Street. And I know you're not all in Sacramento, but some of you are. And if you are, you could certainly pay a visit and make a public comment. And if you are not, you can stream it or watch it on demand for 2 to 3 hours of here's what our legislators think about these issues. And I think that could be super educational for everybody. And, you know, rather than speculating what we think they know and they don't know, let's let them talk for a while, and we'll find out what they do and don't know.
I think it's really really important to recognize a couple things. Number one, if we have to work together on this, we just can't say, I don't have what I need, so you need to give it to me. Okay? We have to work together. That sort of thing has started. Okay? It started with the CPUC, the process that triggered the CPUC thing. There was a meeting two years ago here that Jeff mentioned where the CPUC representative came, he got engaged, he got interested, he approached CMAC to become part of a partner in creating a PSA that the CPUC then distributed there was an education process that went along with that, and there was a relationship building process that went along with that. And Tracy's talked to you about the rest of the stuff that have evolved so far. Huh?
And I will add that the ISPs got incredibly mad at the CPUC for working with CMAC, really pissed off. It was good.
But I also think that we have another thing that most of you don't know about, and that ACD has been working with Jeff and Spiegel and McDermott and funding them to design a model state bill, okay? A model state bill that can be tweaked depending on what the law is in your particular state for you to use to build your local coalition and build your relationships with your local government as the tool, okay, to potentially move forward. That has not existed, designed in a way to try to avoid some of the federal law issues, okay, to try to avoid some of the things. It's not intended as take it to them and ask them to sign the document. It's designed with summary memos and all kinds of tools. And Jeff, you want to talk just briefly about that, because we're right at that point where people are saying, well, where do I go?
Well, and you're also seeing, you know, and this is drawing from what's going on in other states. And I think, you know, that a lot of this is relatively new. And I think that does help with some of the tools. But to be frank, it is an investment of your time and your energy in building this up, as opposed to like it being, like Sue said, a piece of paper that can come and take it. Because some of these things, like in Vermont, the general funding, that's not a complex legal issue for the state to allocate money to this, but it's a long political process to build that support and make that positive case about the value in their investment. And so, I mean, I think some of it too has to be on that positive message and the value brought. And, you know, some of these, like in New York, these taxes on Netflix or the streamers that don't necessarily own the facilities in the rights of way. I think in those situations, in contrast to the broadband franchising, some of the right-of-way thing I think does complicate those discussions, but I think keeping those separate, you can still make the value case for why this is a reasonable approach, why this investment is needed. And again, there've been entertainment taxes and taxes on digital products for a while. Those are well established. The issue is, you know, building the support where some of that money is getting reinvested, and it can be with partners, with local governments, with local journalism, nonprofits, but it's building that case. And again, it's not a one size fits all, and it's working with, you know, like Mike and Mike were saying, you know, are you getting traction with this particular argument if you're trying to build bipartisan support? If not, what other options are out there? But either way, that time built talking to the legislators and getting their, you know, familiar with what you do, what your funding challenges are. That's like the ground level first step, but it's a big one because it takes time and it takes, you know, repeated meetings with them, getting on their level to talk so they understand the history and how we got here. And it's not easy.
So, yeah, Matt?
Just really quick, I encourage people when you're looking at coalition building and some background stuff on the reasoning and vision to look at the Media Power Collaborative. It was organized by Free Press. It has put out a great policy agenda. There's a couple access centers who've already signed on, and some Antoine's a signatory. I'm a signatory on it. Antoine, Dr. Haley helped to craft it. So you don't have to agree with every piece in it, but I encourage media centers to look at that at mediapowercollab.org and see if it resonates with your organization, because the more names that we have on there that are, you know, related to work that we do in civic media, it'll help us have a stronger position as we build a code.
And they're looking for some.
Yeah, actively looking. I'll put it on the listserv and stuff.
Yeah, put it on the listserv, and then we'll also underline it.
So, just to summarize, and there's a lot of discussion that can continue to go on around this sort of Pandora's box that sort of got opened here a little bit. There are things that are happening. There are ways that you can get involved. Those ways can be as simple as starting to help educate your local elected officials, even if you don't have local franchising, about who you are and what you do and why you're important to them. ACM, ACD, Media Alliance have been working together for a while now. They worked on the CPUC project. Okay, and I know I'm kind of California-centric, forgive me right now, okay?
And Maine.
And Maine, Maine, exactly, and worked on Maine. But I think that there's some opportunities to build off what's already being done. I think the idea, as Tracy said, of creating a common, and you brought up too, Roger, about a common language, okay, that we all speak with. This workshop, purposely we did not want a bunch of slides to drive what we said. We wanted to be demonstrative, but we really wanted to get into the legislative process, the regulatory process, the importance of education, and the fact that it is not a one-size-fits-all, it's going to depend on your state and how you do it, and that there are tools that are starting to be developed. If you want to continue to be involved in those tools, then number one, if you're in California, become involved in the Public Policy Committee for ACM. If you're in another state here, create a group if you're in Hawaii, create your own, and you're working together now, I know, on the state stuff there. If you're in New Mexico, whatever, start to build a coalition of people who care about this, but make sure you keep your city folks involved, because that's one of the things that is important to do. And I know here in California, one of the things that's happened is that there was a group called Scanatoa that kind of faded away. now has partnered up with the public information people in the state, but that isn't really necessarily on a lot of the stuff we're talking about, the most natural coalition, but because it was mostly city people, there was a comfort level with that, okay? So we have to engage our folks who are just G folks, government access folks, as well as PEG folks. So think about, at the core of this, how do we educate, how do we build collaborations, and how do we create the tools we all can use to get where we need to go, which is to craft language, whether it's legislative or regulatory, that it can help maintain longevity for community media and go back to the mission that Matt talked about a little bit ago. Why are we here, and why did we start to do this in the first place? And one of the things I don't think, and I agree with you, we don't talk about why we started to do this in the first place, okay? It kind of got lost in a long time ago, and I think it's high time to bring back some conversations and workshops to kind of discuss those things. They kind of anchor us back in our mission and our purpose and why we're here in the first place. So they're going to kick us out of the room because the other group is trying to come in right now. So we'll take this to heart and try to get some more things happening.